Asylum seekers. Those of you living in Australia will certainly be aware of the issue of asylum seekers arriving in Australia in barely seaworthy vessels. Many hundreds of lives have been lost over the decades as a result of this very risky strategy. The parents of my daughter-in-law, in fact, arrived from Vietnam on such a boat back in the 1970s. I'm not sure how widely the situation in Australia is broadcast overseas, and I know that other countries face their own issues with asylum seekers. Here in Australia, the issue is extremely politicised and polarised, as I guess it is everywhere, and particularly so during years of an election. Politicians are tempted to propose what they perceive to be potentially vote-winning hardline policies. And many people in our society, not just here in Australia, seem to expect some kind of quick fix to this worldwide problem. At the time of recording this, according to the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees, the UNHCR, there are approximately 29.4 million officially mandated refugees around the world. 29.4. These are officially mandated refugees. 5.4 million are described as asylum seekers. In other words, they're people who are seeking to become mandated as refugees. Another 62.5 million people are internally displaced. I'll put some links to this information in the description below. Refugee and asylum seeker are not synonymous terms. Many asylum seekers are not finally granted refugee status. It's difficult to find reliable figures for the total number of displaced persons, and even the official sites don't always seem to maintain a clear distinction between the number of asylum seekers and the number of genuine refugees. Okay, so we've established that the whole asylum seeker, displaced person, refugee issue is absolutely massive and possibly intractable, unless we think we can suddenly fix all the problems, the many problems that force people to leave their homes. There are very many reasons why people do this, of course. Among them are war, famine, persecution, flood, and so on. Even climate change these days. Since the end of the Second World War, Australia has taken in just under 1 million refugee and humanitarian entrants through offshore resettlement and onshore protection processes. That's in almost 80 years, just under 1 million. Over the last 10 years or so, Australia has recognised some 48,500 refugees. 48,500 in the last 10 years. But remember, UNHCR mandated refugees represent only a small portion of the number of displaced people in the world. The main point I want to address here today is what seems to me to be the incredibly narrow definition according to the 1951 Refugee Convention. Here it is. A refugee is someone who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable to, or, owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. So someone fleeing their country because of war, famine, flood, or any other reason that does not include this element of persecution can never be considered a refugee under the guidelines of the UNHCR. This seems to me to be a ridiculously narrow definition of refugee, given the present economic, political, and environmental state of this planet. It was devised at a time when it was necessary to protect certain ethnic and religious groups from persecution. This need remains, of course it does, but it seems extraordinarily lacking in compassion to refuse refugee status to someone who flees their country because it's being torn apart by civil war, or because it's no longer able to provide enough food for its population, or because as could and probably will happen in the future, it disappears under the rising ocean. Australia, as a signatory to the Refugee Convention, is only under an obligation to grant asylum to those who meet this very strict definition of refugee. Doesn't compassion demand more of us as a nation? Rather than seeking to narrow the eligibility of the selection criteria, don't we have at least a moral obligation to broaden them? I'm not suggesting that Australia goes it alone down this path, but there is talk of revising the Refugee Convention, which, after all, was put in place to deal with a fairly specific issue at the time. The only compassionate and humanitarian way in which the Convention can be revised is by broadening the definition of refugee to reflect the actual current state of the world. This will mean that more, not fewer, people will need to be granted asylum. At the moment, we're not even scratching the surface.